Duke Calvin of the Northern Territories slammed the letter from Edith onto the desk. "This damn daughter of mine," he cursed. In his fury, Duke Calvin grabbed a glass cup from the desk, intending to smash it on the ground, but he halted mid-action. The cup was made of fine crystal glass, worth almost 3 gold. He couldn't bring himself to break such a valuable item. After some contemplation, he slowly withdrew his hand and placed the cup back on the table. He never would have expected that King Roland would directly revoke all the nobles' fiefdom rights. What shocked him even more was that his daughter, who usually managed to gain advantages for him, had readily agreed to all of His Majesty's conditions and even persuaded Duke Calvin to face reality and not resist stubbornly. Was this really his daughter? Calvin's head ached terribly. If he followed the king's order, he would lose control over the Northern Territory. He had just dealt with the Hose and Lister families, thinking he would finally have control over the entire territory, only to find himself back at square one. But what if he didn't follow His Majesty? Edith included the consequences in the letter. The letter was written in Edith's familiar tone. Calvin could even imagine the sneer on her face as she wrote this letter. Whenever she talked about failure, she would describe her own fate in an eerily calm tone. Edith wrote that she and Cole would be imprisoned forever, while Calvin's fate would be even worse. She even questioned Calvin in the letter, asking him to carefully consider how the fourth prince would treat a duke's daughter who couldn't fight back. Edith could easily list hundreds of humiliating methods that would excite any man. Perhaps, once the fourth prince grew tired of her, she would be discarded, who knows where Roland would send her, and Calvin would lose his daughter forever. The more Calvin read, the angrier he became, especially as Edith had the audacity to threaten him, stating that Calvin and his knights wouldn't last half a day against Roland's army. He could even picture the expression on his daughter's face as she wrote the letter. Although her tone was somewhat exaggerated, he couldn't deny the possibility of her words, having heard of the fourth prince's notorious reputation. With these thoughts in mind, the Duke gradually calmed down. Edith had also written about her observations in the border town, the weapons, technology, economy, and political system. In the end, she suggested that Calvin should send a formal letter to His Majesty, expressing the Northern Territory's submission. With a deep sigh, Calvin carefully put away the letter and spread out a new sheet of blank paper. Since Edith had made her decision, he had no choice but to trust her plan and write a sincere letter to King Roland, pledging allegiance to the new royal capital. However, as a duke, he needed to make one final effort in his own way. If he could tightly bind the interests of their two families together, Calvin would undoubtedly feel much more at ease. For instance, he arranged for his daughter to become the queen. While in the Dragon Fall Ridge, a shell struck the city wall of Dragon Fall Ridge. The commander in charge was Axe, looking through his binoculars, saw a huge crack appear on the stone wall. The 152mm naval artillery had already pierced through the city gate and the northern section of the city wall. Now, they were just waiting for the last entrance to launch a full-scale assault. A soldier atop the lookout post shouted, "There's movement at the city gate, they seem to be assembling horses and knights." Vaynor approached, asking whether they should adjust the naval gun's aim. Axe shook his head. He was not concerned about facing the enemy knights head-on. Turning to Spear, he said, "After this charge, there probably won't be many knights left within the territory." Spear calmly replied, "Since they decided to stand with her brother, these people are no longer her knights. Let them pay the price for their betrayal." Axe nodded, paused for a moment, and then asked how Spear planned to deal with Redwyn. His Majesty had mentioned in a confidential letter that, except for Miss Spear's relatives, all the rebelling nobles of Dragon Fall Ridge should be sent to the city of Neverwinter. As for the Redwyn, Roland planned to leave him to Spear's judgment. A hint of hesitation flashed across Spear's face. She clearly had not made a decision yet. Without pressing her further, Axe turned his attention back to the lookout post, where the observer suddenly shouted, "The enemy is coming." A group of fully armed knights charged out of the shattered city gate on horseback. If Duke Ryan's attack on the border town with his knight order could still pose a slight threat to the First Army a year ago, now they stood no chance. The vanguard battalion was already prepared at the dock, divided into 3 squads, each rushing towards one of the 3 breaches. Each squad was equipped with bolt-action rifles and 2 heavy machine guns. Soon, the battle to recapture Dragon Fall Ridge had officially begun. In less than an hour, the battle was over. The First Army had taken control of the castle, and the church had not made an appearance. All the supplies in the chapel had been completely removed, and the priest's whereabouts were unknown. The nobles were bound and taken captive. As the soldiers moved towards the bedroom, they captured Redwin, who was still shouting loudly, insisting he was the Lord of Dragon Fall Ridge and demanding to be treated as such. Spear looked at her younger brother, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "What benefits does being a lord bring to Redwin? He and their third brother neither understand how to manage state affairs nor have any knowledge of trades. Even if Redwin sits in this position, he is just handing over his power to other vassals and ministers." Spear wonders why Redwin trusts his own sister less than an outsider. Redwin shouted stubbornly, calling Spear a witch, saying Spear was just a bastard adopted by his father. Spear was stunned. Redwin continued to shout, claiming Spear was just a mistake their father had made when he was young, and Spear didn't truly bear their family's name. According to him, Redwin was the one who should rightfully inherit the family. Spear was uncertain whether Redwin was telling the truth or not, and sensing that the situation was taking a turn for the worse, Axe was about to intervene. However, Spear coldly looked at Redwin and said, "So, you are not my brother either? In that case, Redwin should receive the punishment he deserves." Having said that, Spear turned and walked towards the main gate, instructing Axe to send Redwin to the city of Neverwinter, stating that Redwin had lost his sanity and perhaps the coal mines were the place he belonged. Redwin continued to shout, but Spear remained unswayed. Looking over Dragon Fall Ridge, she thought to herself, hoping that this land would be better governed under Roland's rule. In the city of Neverwinter, heavy rain was pouring down, with dense raindrops hitting the glass windows, creating a pitter-patter sound, accompanied by flashes of lightning. The view outside became blurry and indistinct. Roland was standing in front of the window, gazing into the hazy city under the rain. A song continued to linger in his ears. He reminisced about the drama premiere 3 days ago. The effect was astonishing when paired with Echo's ability. The audience of 5,000 people, including Roland himself, felt a deep sense of awe emanating from their hearts. This was the power of the resonance song. Lost in thought, Roland was suddenly brought back to reality when the office door was knocked. Barav entered the room. Ever since the Plague City of Love was performed, many residents have been flocking to the city hall to apply for housing rentals and purchase their own homes. There has also been a significant increase in marriages. Roland commended Barav for his good work and emphasized the need to continue expanding the recruitment of migrants and refugees. A sufficient population is crucial for the development of the city of Neverwinter. Scroll was called over, and Roland poured a cup of tea for her. He expressed his desire to expand the scope of education to include the refugees who had just arrived in the city of Neverwinter. Scroll thought for a moment and then candidly stated that it might be challenging to achieve this at the moment. They had a shortage of teaching staff and classrooms, which made it difficult to cater to everyone's needs. Roland proposed a suggestion to alleviate the pressure on the teachers and enable self-learning. He explained that they could conduct a public class once a week to teach the basics of reading and writing. For the rest of the time, the students could use picture books with phonetic annotations to practice on their own. There would be no exams and no mandatory attendance, it would all depend on the individual's initiative. Scroll pondered for a moment, saying, "If that's the case, without someone looking after them, it would be impressive if 1 in 10 people managed to learn on their own." Roland smiled, he just wants to give everyone a chance. There will always be those who are not satisfied with a mundane, low-paying job and who aspire to reach their goals more quickly. To prevent these people from taking the wrong path, they must guide them to self-improvement in the right way. If they want to secure stable housing and escape a life of poverty and toil, teaching themselves to read and write is a good option. once they take the initiative to self-learn. This method can also help those to join the city's development sooner. In the witch's residence, Wendy woke up to find that the heavy rain that had lasted all night had finally stopped. Yawning and stretching, she got out of bed, pushed open the window, and then returned to the bedside to pinch the cheek of Nightingale, who responded with a muffled snort and buried her face in the pillow. Wendy shook her head with a smile and then went to have breakfast by herself. The Witch Union had never set a fixed time for getting up, so everyone tended to trickle in for breakfast at their own pace. Lightning and Maisie were always the first, followed by people like Anna, Agatha, and Lucia. Wendy fell somewhere in the middle. Nightingale was always the last to get up, influenced by His Majesty's love of sleeping in. Unless there was a pressing matter, Roland wouldn't start dealing with official duties until the sun was high in the sky, and Nightingale had picked up this habit. Despite once being one of the most vigilant and sharp members back in the Witches' Association, always alert to the slightest hint of trouble, her habits had changed. Surprisingly, Wendy didn't see this as a bad thing. After finishing her breakfast, she went to the first floor of the Witch Building. As soon as she entered the building, Ling greeted her, followed by a few girls of similar age. Wendy said good morning to the three little girls, sat down at the office desk, and then asked about the sales of the first volume of the Witch Diary. Ling happily reported that it was very popular. Another girl reported that they had sold around 60 copies in the last week, and at this rate, the initially printed 1,000 copies would be sold out in another half a month. Wendy was somewhat surprised to hear this result. After all, as a purely entertaining book that neither fills the stomach nor aids in studies, and with a rather high price, it was incredible that it sold so well. The idea had originally come from Roland, and seeing its popularity, Wendy felt greatly encouraged. She couldn't wait to spread out her paper and pen, beginning to brainstorm the content for the next picture book. With a smile, Wendy said that the next book would feature Echo as the main character. She asked the three little girls what they thought of the title Echo, the Silver Moon Princess from the far south, a land of raging sands and underground flames. The three girls' eyes sparkled as they exclaimed, "That's amazing!" Wendy then told them that after King Roland reclaimed the Southern Territory, everyone would have the chance to see what Echo's homeland was like. This was Wendy's job, to promote the witches, allowing everyone to have a better understanding of witches. Echo had already become a hit with the Starflower Troupe, and her immersive music had won the actors' unanimous praise. Evelyn had opened a bar, primarily offering uniquely flavored mixed spirits and cocktails. Wendy had heard that Hummingbird would also be joining the City Hall, becoming the deputy minister of the construction department, making her the second witch to become a City Hall official after Scroll. Everyone was working hard, building the city of Neverwinter, while gradually making the citizens accept the witch's existence, seeing them as equals. The day Roland had promised, Wendy felt, was now within reach. In the City of Dawn, at midnight, in the palace garden, Otto and Oro sneaked behind a massive rock, with Otto feeling a bit nervous. Knowing this is the king's bedroom, Oro rolled his eyes, saying this was Otto's idea. Why is he chickening out now? He recalled how, a few days ago, Otto had even dared to probe Lord Quinn about Andrea's current situation, and they both thought Lord Quinn's gaze was as if he wanted to arrest them on the spot. If it weren't for the fact that they had been Andrea's playmates when they were kids, they might have been in big trouble. The news that Lord Quinn had told them was astonishing. Since the king had fallen ill, the crown prince had been frequently meeting with an alchemist in the palace, even asking visitors who came to inquire about the illness to leave. Lord Quinn had caught a glimpse of the alchemist, saying she was a young woman, shrouded in a black veil. Hearing this, Otto couldn't help but think of the church. If it hadn't been for his trip to the border town, he might not have made such a connection. But after meeting Roland and learning about how the church secretly cultivated witches called the Pure Ones, in an attempt to subvert the kingdoms and amass power for the Divine War, the two of them pried open the secret passage, their secret meeting place from their childhood gatherings. Otto remarked that back then, they were only 10 years old, and if His Majesty found out, he would have just scolded them. But now, breaking in without permission, he had no idea what His Majesty might think. Aro took out a glass bottle from his waist pouch, opened the lid, and poured the amber liquid onto the railing, instantly dissolving the iron bars. The two entered the passage, and at the end of the secret tunnel was the back of the fireplace in the king's bedroom. They pressed their eyes to the cracks to see inside. The fireplace was directly opposite a large bed, on which the king lay. Prince Enpian paced back and forth beside the bed, his expression filled with anxiety. "You guys are late," Enpian spoke irritably. The blonde woman in front of him bowed and replied, "There were some issues on the way, which caused a delay." The woman in black veils responded coldly, "There's no need to inform him. Just help him wake his father up." This was no other than Isabella and Black Veil. Isabella took out something from her sleeve, smiling, telling Black Veil to not say that. They still need the prince's help. She took out a green bottle. The prince tried to reach out and take it, but Black Veil stopped him. She reminded the prince of their agreement. The medicine needs to be fed by her personally to be effective. And as part of their exchange, an Enpian must fulfill the Pope's requests, she stated. Hearing this, Otto and Oro, hiding behind the fireplace, were shocked. After hearing the word Pope, they then understood that these two were sent by the church. Black Veil sat at the bedside, questioning the prince, "Why hasn't the road to the Wolfheart Kingdom been closed after a whole month? Why are there still so many refugees entering the country recently?" Enpian clenched his fists, responding, "If the refugees are forbidden from entering, many will die on the road because there are no cities nearby to provide them with food." The woman interrupted impatiently, "What does that have to do with the church? What does their death have to do with Enpian? He should be focusing on the king." She then questioned if Enpian was thinking of breaking their agreement. Enpian clearly hesitated. After a long while, he finally said, he will completely close all of the routes within a week. But if refugees try to cross the mountains instead of using the roads, he can't do anything about that. Isabella nodded in agreement. Then, Black Veil took the bottle, took a small sip, and bent over onto the bed, delivering the medicine into the king's mouth. After a moment, she raised her head, wiped her mouth, and said that should do it. "The king will wake up in half an hour, just like before." The prince asked, "Does the medicine have to be fed mouth to mouth?" Black Veil affirmed, "Yes, and it must be fed by her. As long as Enpian keeps his promise, the king will recover fully and be even healthier than before." As Black Veil and Isabella prepared to leave, Prince Enpian suddenly asked if they were witches. They halted in their tracks. He slowly suggested that the requirement for only her to be fed the medicine could only be explained by the magical power of a witch, adding that although it was incredible to think there could be witches within the church, their actions were no different from those of demons. Isabella laughed softly, asking if that was all he wanted to say. Prince Enpian then shouted, "Come out!" This startled Otto and Oro, who were still hidden, but they then saw over a dozen fully armored guards wearing Stone of God punishments emerging from a wardrobe and under the bed, swiftly surrounding the two pure ones. Isabella looked around disdainfully. Black Veil shook her head, commenting that the church obviously hadn't made a strong enough impression on Enpian. Prince Enpian roared, perhaps revealing the fury he had kept suppressed for so long. He declared that even though the gods' punishment army they had shown him before might be incredibly powerful, they were not present at that moment. He then ordered the guards to seize the two women. Isabella laughed softly and asked if the witch they had encountered on the road had also been arranged by him. Enpian, his voice filled with suppressed anger, dismissed it as a common trick used by the rats. He pointed out that without the protection of God's punishment soldiers, the two of them were no different from ordinary people when faced with the Stone of God punishments. He then demanded that they hand over the medicine. Isabella sighed, looking at the expressions of the two women. Enpian, completely provoked by their nonchalant attitudes, watched as his guards, armed with shields embedded with the Stone of God punishments, advanced toward the two witches. However, before they could reach them, the guards suddenly turned their swords on themselves, slicing into their own necks. Blood splattered as the guards fell one after another. Prince Anpian was trembling uncontrollably as if he had witnessed something utterly horrifying. The momentum and fury that had fueled him just moments ago drained away rapidly. Soon after, a wet patch appeared in the middle of his trousers as he lost control of his bladder, with urine trickling down his legs. Black Veil steadily approached the prince, step by step. Otto and Oro, hidden in the secret chamber, were eager to rush out, but the mechanisms to open it could only be operated from inside the room. Isabella suggested not to take things too far. With a snap of her fingers, Black Veil intending to give the prince a lesson, he suddenly seemed to snap out of a trance and sat down on the ground, shivering and scooting backward. He asked, confused, even with all these Stone of God punishments. Anpian stuttered out a question, wondering how the two witches could possibly still use their powers. Isabella smiled faintly, explaining that it was because they were the pure ones. Isabella then suggested that the prince should adhere to their agreement earnestly. His father would eventually be safe and sound, and once the church took over Grey Castle, the prince could become one of them. Even if the Kingdom of Dawn is taken over by the church, the prince can still enjoy a life of wealth and comfort. His people can be spared from the suffering of war. Why bother making these foolish moves now? As she left the room, she turned back and added, the prince should clean up this place. The king will wake up soon, and he probably wouldn't want to see his bedroom in such a state. Otto felt his back soaked with cold sweat. The pure ones, who were not afraid of the Stone of God's punishments, along with the church's plan to first conquer Grey Castle and then take over the Kingdom of Dawn, all sent chills down his spine. The church has long seen the four great kingdoms as meat in their mouths. This is exactly what His Majesty Roland said. Oro wondered aloud what they should do. Oro thought this was way beyond what they can handle. They must inform their father and Lord Quinn. However, Otto was skeptical. What good will tell them to do? They are dealing with people who are not even afraid of Stone of God punishments. Otto closed his eyes and said, he knows someone who can deal with them. They need to go to the Grey Castle ambassador immediately and pass on what they've heard to His Majesty Roland Wimbledon. In the city of Neverwinter, in the border town, Roland was reading a reply letter from Duke Calvin with a smile. Nightingale appeared behind him and asked what he was laughing at. Roland found Duke Calvin's reply letter quite amusing. First, the Duke inquired about when Roland was going to hold the coronation ceremony so he could prepare to come and congratulate him. At the end of the letter, the Duke proposed a marriage alliance, praising his daughter Edith's beauty and talent on an entire page, claiming that she could handle both domestic and foreign affairs perfectly, making her the best queen candidate. Nightingale took the letter and frowned after reading a few lines. She then turned around asking Roland isn't going to agree, right? Roland, of course, had no intention of agreeing. Jockling said if Edith is really as outstanding as the letter describes, he'd be afraid to let her into the castle. Of course, this was a joke. Roland did not need a political marriage to stabilize his throne. Nightingale sighed in relief because she knew Roland was telling the truth. Suddenly, a flying messenger bird flew through the open window and landed on the desk. It was a secret letter from the old capital, indicating that there was news from the City of Dawn. Roland fed the bird some fish jerky and opened the confidential letter. It seems Ambassador York is quite competent, he commented. However, his expression changed abruptly as he read the letter. The first sentence of the letter gave him a big shock. The Dawn Palace has been infiltrated by the Pure One. Their abilities can ignore Stone of God punishments. The Crown Prince tried to resist, but the guards, under the control of the Pure One, committed suicide with their own swords. The church intends to attack Grey Castle first. Witnessing all this were Otto and Oro, and the three great families hoped to get Roland's help. After a while, the two of them watched the secret letter burn, feeling a heavy weight in their hearts. A witch immune to the effects of the Stone of God punishments. As far as they knew, only the extraordinary witches could achieve this. Apart from that, there were the high-ranking demons known as magic slayers. Roland took a deep breath, suddenly realizing that he had to make significant adjustments to his plan to reclaim the southern territory. Quickly, Roland convened a strategic discussion meeting in the castle's room. Axe suggested replacing the soldiers of the First Army stationed at Dragonfall Ridge with newly trained recruits, as they should have no problem dealing with those nobles. The First Army needed to be concentrated together to defend against the church. Roland agreed and turned to look at the map, realizing they were now facing two issues: first, when the enemy would attack, and second, where the enemy would start their attack. Roland roughly recounted the contents of the secret letter, wanting to hear everyone's suggestions. Barif spoke first, stating that no matter where they appeared, the enemy would first have to pass through the kingdom's northern territories, all of which were under the jurisdiction of Duke Calvin right now. He suggested letting Miss Edith deliver this message to her father. Edith stood up and said that while it was indeed necessary to dispatch people to monitor all of the possible routes, it didn't mean that was a good method. They needed to act quickly to buy enough time for Roland. Roland shifted his gaze towards Edith, who confidently responded, "Send people to Hermes." Carter frowned, displaying his concern and curiosity about Edith's plan. Carter expressed his doubts about the efficacy of sending people over to the holy city of the church, and Petrov added that it would be difficult to blend in since the local population is full of fanatic followers of the church. Edith smiled and explained that there was no need to enter the holy city, it would suffice to find merchants nearby and have a good chat with them.